the kind of evolutionary origins of sex, for obvious reasons, propagation of species, but why parent bonding, why love, why do we need all this extra stuff? Why not just swap your genes?
Helen and others argued that we started to see social monogamy in our species history around 4 to 4.4 million years ago. What's interesting about that is only about 3% of mammals engage in social monogamy, about 15% of primates. But what's important there is biologists and anthropologists, when we talk about monogamy, we don't do it in the sense that we often hear in the colloquial use of monogamy. We actually talk about two different levers of monogamy. When you look at the satisfaction rates of people in monogamous relationships and negotiated consensual non-monogamy relationships, they're the same. There's really no differences. And I think that that's so important because it blows up sort of two arguments about, if you have a moral argument about monogamous relationships, that they're so much better than any other structure, well, it turns out that satisfaction rates are the same. But the other argument that we'll sometimes see is sometimes folks who are non-monogamous will take a view that, well, monogamy is this shackle that it's imposed by society and you just have to get rid of it and then we can just have free love and we'll be more happy. Well, actually, you're not any more happy. So the satisfaction rates are the same.
Is there any data showing that sex is perceived to be more pleasurable if it's also involved in intimacy, besides the random one-night stand and everybody has a good time, but you don't do that all the time, or else it wouldn't be a one-night stand. But in general, it's more pleasurable if you're intimate with somebody.
I love that you asked this. We do have data on this, and
hey, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show, brought to you by the Skeptic Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. So if you want to subscribe, go to skeptic.com/subscribe. And if you want to give us a little love and support, go to skeptic.com/donate. All right. My guest today is Dr. Justin Garcia. He's an evolutionary biologist and sex researcher. His research program focuses on the evolutionary and biocultural foundations of romantic and sexual relationships across the life course. He has served as the executive director of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University since 2019 and as the scientific advisor to Match.com since 2010. He's the author of Evolution and Human Sexual Behavior from Harvard University Press and editor of Evolution's Empress, Darwinian Perspectives on the Nature of Women. His new book, here it is, The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love. I just finished reading it this morning, Justin. It was great. Oh, man.
Great.
This book should do really well. Sex, 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 and sex. Oh, yeah.
And the science of it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank goodness for that. I mean,
Yeah.
I read in there that you're the first evolutionary biologist to head the Kinsey Institute. That's quite surprising considering Alfred Kinsey was an evolutionary biologist, right?
Yeah, since Dr. Kinsey himself, we've had psychiatrists, psychologists, anthropologists, and I think so much of what Dr. Kinsey did in his original research, when we realized he was an entomologist and evolutionary biologist, it suddenly makes sense. Even his sort of the famous Kinsey scale for looking at sexual orientation, the 0 to 6 scale, exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, that's an insight from an evolutionist because we're in the business of looking at diversity of traits and thinking about continuums. So it's been a fun legacy to be a part of.
I'll say, here's what I wrote about him in my book, The Science of Good.
Yeah.
After earning a doctorate from Harvard and landing a post at the University of Indiana, he spent the next 20 years of his career logging tens of thousands of miles and collecting some 300,000 specimens of gall wasps, publishing the results of his research in 2 large monographs in 1930 and 1936. Quote, in the intensive and extensive measurement of tens of thousands of small insects, I have made some attempt to secure the specific data and the quantity of data on which scientific scholarship must be based. During the past 2 years, as a result of a convergence of circumstances, I have found myself confronted with material on variation in certain types of human behavior. Gee, I wonder what that is. In 1938, as the university wanted to offer a course on marriage, a euphemism at the time for sex education, the entomologist was asked to serve as a chairman of the committee to regulate the course and to give 3 lectures on the biology of sex. Thorough scientist that he was, he went to the library and found virtually nothing on human sexuality. So he began to research the subject himself. A student had scrawled a graffito on the title page of Harvard's only copy of the 1936 WASP monograph. Quote, why don't you write about something more interesting, Al? That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
And he did. He wrote about human sexuality. Wow. It's amazing
Yeah.
it took that long. I mean, just really. So,
Yeah.
when were those published, those monographs on human sexuality? 1950s or something?
Yeah, the first one was 1948, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, and then 1953, Sexual Behavior of the Human Female, the two original Kinsey reports. There was another one. When he died, he was in the process of doing a third one, more focused on pregnancy and abortion, actually, way ahead of its time also,
Oh, wow.
and how that was impacting people's sexual behaviors and lives.
Right.
And in some ways, I love the story that you were sharing, too, and it's a reminder of also what we're supposed to do at universities, this idea that there were so many questions, you couldn't find the answers in a library, that students had so many questions that as a faculty member, our responsibility is let's go research it. Let's go find answers to those questions.
Here's what he wrote. Taxonomist generalizations of species, genera, and even higher categories are too often descriptions of unique individuals and structures of particular individuals that are not quite like anything that any other investigator will ever find. A mouse in a maze today is taken as a sample of all individuals of all species of mice under all sorts of conditions, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. A half dozen dogs, pedigrees unknown and breeds unnamed, are reported upon in the scientific literature as dogs, meaning all types of dogs, if indeed the conclusions are not explicitly or at least implicitly implied to you, your cousins, and all other kinds of descriptions of humans. Right. So, I mean, that's astonishing. Isn't that obvious? You should collect, just gazillion data points before you draw conclusions?
Yeah, he was in the business of big data before we think about it in the contemporary sense of big data. But exactly, that there's variation, and for biologists, how we understand that variation and how it impacts physiology, function, evolutionary process, and selection, but our behavior. And I think what I've been interested in is when it comes to our intimate lives, when it comes to love and sex, we think that there are these answers that we can all, we all have similar questions, but we think that there's answers that are right for everyone. But once we understand some of that variation, we can understand the challenges that we all experience.
I love how you open your story of going to Pahrump, Nevada. I don't know if you know this, but that was also the home of Art Bell's late night radio show that kind of...
I didn't know.
Oh, yeah. He broadcast out of there midnight to 5 a.m. or whatever it was. I used to do that show remotely.
Yeah.
We're talking to Bob on the Interstate 10. He sees a UFO. So I had no idea there was a brothel there. So tell us the story. You go there to do what?
Yeah, and actually, so I was in Las Vegas because I was taking the other part of the story is we were in Las Vegas because we were collecting hormone samples in a sex club in Las Vegas, and we were interested in, there are all these studies about the sort of physiological response to sexual activity, and people take for granted that testosterones and androgens and estrogens respond to sexual activity. The academic literature is actually fairly complex on that, and it's we were trying to get samples not in a laboratory. So where do you go where people are engaging in sexual activity? You can also do at-home kits, but this was a different kind of... it was my favorite... of all the articles I've written, one of my favorite methods sections. It was like samples were collected between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. And so that's what first brought us to Nevada. And then we went to Pahrump. It's about an hour outside of Vegas, where there are legal brothels. And we had a tour. We were given a tour of the facilities. We were talking to folks. They knew that we were researchers. And should I keep going with the story?
Oh, yeah.
All right. And what we found was during the tour, there was kind of an easel that was put up, a menu of options that people could have when they come out. And there's all sorts of different sexual behaviors, and some for individuals, some for couples, some for that are more kink or specific to niche interests. And then I noticed something on that list. It was called the white whale. And we said, well, what's that? And it was the most expensive thing. If you were our tour guide kind of joked and said, that's for the high rollers. And it was the most expensive thing. It was about $20,000 at the time. And what I was stunned by was that when you go to a legal brothel, of all the different sexual varieties someone might want, the most expensive thing was intimacy. The most expensive thing was what's called the girlfriend experience. And that was more of a date. And you had about 2 bottles of champagne, you had a dinner, you had a much longer experience. But part of that experience was couching. If there was going to be any sexual activity, it was couching it in terms of this sort of relational interaction. You were kind of on a date, and you had more conversation. I thought that was so fascinating, that of all the things that people crave the most, what they're willing to spend the most on, it was feigning intimacy.
But was there any doubt, at least in the guy's mind, that at the end of the evening he was going to have sex?
Well, it depends. So it's interesting about these legal brothels. So each individual woman, they were all women workers, negotiate their own sort of rates and things that they will or won't do. Typically, you would expect sexual activity, and the women that we talked to said, but that was expected. But in some cases, not. In some cases, they were almost more like dates, and then sometimes they would run out of time because they would spend so much time having conversations.
Wow.
So it was expected, but it was certainly not 100% of the time, which is also shocking.
Yeah, because I was thinking, if you're out on an actual date, you don't know how the evening is going to end up.
Yeah.
But if you pay somebody, I mean, that sort of changes the dynamic. Like we both know what's going to happen by the end of the evening. Okay, maybe not 100% of the time, but that sort of implied. And I also thought $20,000. If you're a single guy and you're just going to, why not just go out on dates? I mean, you could have some pretty fancy dinners and.
Yeah.
Are they just not having access to it? Is it just easy access? Like, I don't have to shop around and spend time communicating. I just go straight to the door, tell them that's what I want, and then off we go.
Yeah, and I think what it was is that it was exactly as you were saying, Michael. This combination of typically you're expecting sexual activity. You might not get that if you're just going on a bunch of dates or if you're just swiping and trying to find dates. So it's a little bit more consistent. You know what's going to happen. You're going to go have this experience. You can plan if there's going to be sexual activity. And for some people, that means certain rituals, certain medications. You kind of know what's going to happen. And it was couching it in terms of this connection. And there's also another component when you're paying is that the women across the table are employees for a few hours, so they're more accommodating to your desires and your interests and your personality. But you're right. The other part of that is going on dates, but it's not a sure thing, and a lot of people struggle with that. That dating is a competition. It's one of our species' grand competitions. It's courtship, and that's a challenge. And sometimes people don't want to spend that much time to go through that. But it would be financially, it's cheaper, but there's also this time investment and an emotional investment to try and really connect with someone, and then maybe go on some dates, and then maybe have sex, and then in some ways, if your heart is in it, what happens? And for me, as someone who studies both love and sex, that's what's so interesting. People are doing much more intense things for love and intimacy than they do just for sex. Even though we all talk about this idea that people do wild things for sex, well, it turns out they do much wilder things for love and for intimacy.
Yeah. Do you know the sex workers line about they don't pay me to come, they pay me to leave?
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. But
the guy on the actual dates, then the girl's going to expect him to call the next day or like, hey, let's go out again. And he's like, no, that's all I wanted. I'm done.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that, and I agree, it's a funny joke, but when we look at studies where people have interviewed sex workers, what we find is that a lot of them do have repeat clients. A lot of them do have experiences where maybe you book an hour and 40 minutes you spend having a conversation, and the guy's talking about his life or his career or his family. So there's a lot more there that happens in reality when we peel one layer back and we start, and I think that's true of so much about our romantic and sexual lives, that we operate a lot in kind of mythology. And once we really peel back and look at the science and look at some of the data, people are doing a lot more complicated things, often this sort of combination of not just a physical behavior, not just a sexual behavior, but couching it in terms of all these intimate interactions.
Is there any data showing that sex is perceived to be more pleasurable if it's also involved in intimacy? Besides the random one night stand and everybody has a good time, but you don't do that all the time, or else it wouldn't be a one night stand. But in general, it's more pleasurable if you're intimate with somebody.
I love that you asked this. We do have data on this. And what we found is we asked people about their sexual experiences and where they had pleasurable sexual experiences, the context of them. And what we found is that for both men and women, they reported that when they loved someone, the sex was better. And at pretty high rates, that if they loved a partner, the quality of the sex was better. And that aligns with some literature on the relationship between relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction. They're highly linked to each other. Now, early in my career, I worked on hookup culture. I worked on casual sex. And my interest was, my dissertation was on the evolution of monogamy. So I was interested in, well, what's going on in the real world on a college campus? There's all this hookups and no strings attached sex. And how do you make sense of that with these theories about pair bonding and forming relationships? How are young people navigating that both? It was the sort of theoretical question I was interested in. And what we found was that there's all sorts of cases where casual sex was turning into relationships or people wanted it to be relationships. And to the question you just asked me, I assume that for many people, well, weren't these uncommitted or casual encounters places you could maybe try things that you wouldn't do with a long-term partner for all sorts of reasons? You were afraid, you didn't like how it maybe changed how you thought of the partner, which we know can happen for some folks. But it turns out, yes, so people were more willing to explore sexually in uncommitted encounters, to maybe try a new behavior or something they've never done. So people were saying, well, maybe I would try a threesome with a casual partner because I don't really know that I want to do it with someone I'm married to, because I don't know if that'll screw up our relationship. But when it came to the quality and the pleasure and the enjoyment and the satisfaction, all sort of similarly related constructs, it was those loving relationships that they were much higher. And for me, that's because it's couching it in terms of that intimacy, that's part of what we crave as a social animal.
And were there any male-female differences on that finding?
There were some male differences, some gender differences. If I recall correctly, men were slightly higher in terms of reporting that the quality of sex in a loving relationship was better. So, and something may be surprising for some people that men in particular, I think men are much more romantic than we realize when we look at the evidence. They value love in their sexual relationships. They value pair bonds. They suffer more for breakups. They actually take longer to get over a broken heart than women. They're more likely to commit suicide after a breakup than women. They are interested in courtship and dating. I think we sometimes we misunderstand men. Not you. You weren't suggesting that. Just reminded me that.
Well, yes, and I'm a member of the species, so
yeah,
and that's my experience. Having loving, intimate sex and just a one night stand or whatever, which pretty much everybody's had at least one of those. And it's just much better when you know the person and there's love and so on. This isn't really a part of your book, but I wanted to ask you this because I've had a couple sex workers on the show. I had Rachel Moran, who was a activist against prostitution, and then I had Ayala. You probably know Ayala, A-E-L-L-A, who is a proponent of sex work and before I started looking into all this, my libertarian like propensities were supporting of it in the sense of it's none of my business what consenting adults do, just go for it. And but Rachel's point is that prostitution is often abusive of women. And also there's some underage and drug-related issues in the business, even when attempts to regulate it in some northern European countries, for example, where there's unions and the building is controlled and the women are protected or whatever, they still get abused. So, on average, okay, so you have overlapping bell curves. So you have the ALs that go, hey, it's great, I'm making a ton of money, I'm having fun. But on average, most women say, in the long run, this is not good for women. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? The legal aspects, should it be legalized and regulated or what?
Oh, yeah. So you're touching on one of the great debates in the field. And in fact, you captured these views that those of us in sexology or gender studies or people who are interested in sex research and practice continue to debate. And these are debates that have been happening since the 70s. So I think the point being there's really not clear answers on sex work. A lot of the language has changed. We know a lot more about like the fact that we call it sex work and not necessarily prostitution, so the recognizing the labor and the work component. My view is that there's pros and cons to both of those arguments. The challenge with legalization, I lean towards this idea of I don't like too much government involvement in people's sexual lives. I think we see throughout history that can become challenging once we regulate people's romantic and sexual lives. with exceptions of these questions of consent, and that's, that we certainly should regulate protecting children. And then these questions on sex workers, do we need regulations to protect women and men and other minority groups that are often engaged in sex work? The challenge is exactly as you were pointing to. Well, if we can have regulation that says, okay, you have to have STI checks, you have to have safety things in place, does that make it safer for people? And we know in the absence of that, like in the United States, a lot of sex work happens where there's a lot of violence, there's sexually transmitted infections, there's unintended pregnancies, but there's a lot of violence, there's sort of pimp violence, and then women don't feel, I say women, but we know that there's both men and women sex workers, but predominantly they're women. Where do you go? Where do you report that if you're abused by a so-called client, or you don't get paid, or you... Now, what's interesting about the Pahrump context is where they're legal, they have a doctor that comes every week, everyone gets tested, but there are also these nuances, like the women can't leave the facility for more than, I think it's 3 hours, because the idea is then they're trying to cut the house out, so they're going to take the client down the block. Okay. And then their STI card is not good, so they were checked by a physician, they know that they don't have sexually transmitted infections. So there's a lot of complications, even where it kind of looks like, okay, well, there's all these things in place that make it healthy and equitable. Sometimes it's not. So I know I haven't really answered your question. I don't know that I have a good answer, because I think there's a lot of pros and cons, depending on the context, depending on the resources, depending on the sort of political environment. But I tend to lean towards this idea that we do better when there's less regulation around what people are doing in their romantic and sexual lives, with this exception, when I'm a very strong exception of when it's these issues of consent. And I think that we do need to really regulate. And part of the reason we need to regulate, we actually just published a paper on that, is because we don't educate about it. We asked people in a national study, we looked at over 5,000 single adults, what were your sources of sex education? Where did you learn about different things? Pleasure, sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy. We asked about consent. It was roughly around 15% of people had ever formally talked about consent with their parents or their guardians. So the reality is, we live in the United States. We have a country that people aren't educated about sex. They're not getting any formal education. It's not happening in the home. Parents and guardians don't feel that they're able. They don't have the skill. And the bottom line is they're just not having the conversations. Less than 20% are ever talking to kids about consent. So in that context, that's when I then think, we're living in a social context that we're not educating about realities of sex, even the most serious, no less pleasure, but also not things like consent. That makes these conversations or these debates about regulating even more complex, because we're debating things that most of the country is ignorant about.
Astonishing that could be the case now with the internet and knowledge like this just readily accessible everywhere, including on TikTok videos or Wikipedia or whatever. I mean, there should be no excuse for not having the information you need about sex, especially about birth control. I've been ranting about this for a long time. I mean, the problem is not abortion, it's unwanted pregnancies. Why are women getting pregnant when they don't want to? Because they're not using birth control, or they don't have the education about how to access it, or it's not accessible. I mean, really? How is that possible in the 21st century?
And then how do you curate it? So if you don't have this idea that so all of us can go online and find information, but there's so much nonsense. And how do you really curate through, where do you have the experts that help you say what's useful, what's not? What are the sources that you go to? And for instance, something like birth control is really interesting, because okay, could women get access to it? But how do they also know how many they're supposed to try? Because we know that many women go on 2, 3, 5 different types of hormonal birth control because they have so many side effects. So then they have to go back and forth to doctor's appointments. They're on a medication for a few months, then they try another one that has different side effects, then another one that has different side effects. And how do you pay for those medical appointments? Where are you getting information? Where are you deciding? So there's just so much lack of education and lack of resources and information. And in a context where there's all this shame that people are embarrassed to say that, okay, I'm going back to the doctor again for birth control, or I'm trying to find condoms, or it's since Dr. Kinsey's time. You'd think we were doing better, 80 years since he embarked on his studies. We still have these huge gaps in sexual knowledge. But that's why part of my goal with the Intimate Animal and what we do here at the Kinsey Institute is how do we keep doing more research and have evidence and data to support understanding our sexual lives.
And the data keeps changing. Let's talk then about the kind of evolutionary origins of sex, for obvious reasons, propagation of species. But why pair bonding? Why love? Why do we need all this extra stuff? Why not just swap your genes?
Yeah. So, one of the arguments, actually, my colleague Helen Fisher launched, which, funny enough, if Michael can see my screen behind me, I have a sculpture of gibbons, which are the socially monogamous primate, which is okay. From the estate of my my good friend, the late great anthropologist Helen Fisher. And Helen and others argued that we started to see social monogamy in our species history around 4 to 4.4 million years ago. And what's interesting about that is only about 3% of mammals engage in social monogamy, about 15% of primates. But what's important there is biologists and anthropologists, when we talk about monogamy, we don't do it in the sense that we often hear in the colloquial use of monogamy. We actually talk about two different levers of monogamy, and it's social monogamy, which is the pair bond, and sexual monogamy, which is sexual fidelity. And when we can understand that there's somewhat different mechanisms and that they had different evolutionary pressures, that I think suddenly it's like the lights have been turned on, and we could say, okay, the pair bond, the romantic relationship, the context of most sex and reproduction for our species doesn't always necessarily mean fidelity. And in fact, one often tries to enforce the other, but that there's these separate motivations for sexual novelty, even while maintaining that relationship. That, for me, is at the core of so much of understanding these questions about the evolution of love and sex. And but the argument for our species is that about 15% of mammals engage in pair bonding, like humans, like those gibbons behind me. And gibbons are the only other ape that exhibit pair bond behavior, and the lesser ape. And for us, it was quite important in evolutionary terms for how our species navigated and how our species migrated and how our species evolved. And part of what happens in a pair bond is that you have another individual who is helping not just raise offspring, but helping weather uncertainty. So what's so interesting about pair bonds is it's not just reproduction. It's not just feeding the baby. It's getting resources. It's taking care of you when you're ill. It's managing uncertainty in the environment, and then the environment in the grand scheme of what are the predators, what are the resources, what is the food availability, what is the weather, what are the other social individuals that we're dealing with. You have a co-pilot, you have a co-CEO to sort of navigate the world with. And I think that's part of our story of why we've been such a successful species.
Yeah. Certainly, that's the case. It's astonishing that it takes, an anthropologist, someone outside of the field of the psychology of sex, to actually put some data on it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think psychologists suffered from the fact that that love didn't have a very clean definition, that it was Elaine Hatfield, who's the famous social psychologist who studied romantic love, brilliant scientist. She often said there would be pushback of people saying, well, how do you really define this? It's a soft concept and have a really clear construct. And how is it the same for everyone? And Helen was just such a brilliant scientist.
Hatfield, wasn't that the study where they asked college students, I saw you standing there, found you attractive, wondered if you'd go out on a date, wondering if you'd come back to my dorm, wondering if you'd have sex with me. Yeah. And the massive male-female difference there.
There's a big gender bias. Oh, and years later, there was a study at University of Michigan that said that if you control for this sense of safety, if women really, part of the argument that was made by feminist psychologists later was, well, for a lot of women, it might not feel safe to go back to someone's dorm room if you're a stranger that you met. But if you can create context where people feel safe, you reduce the gender difference a little bit. But that was Elaine's classic study. And on the topic of Helen Fisher and John Tierney, I actually walked them down the aisle when they got married. They're both wonderful friends of mine. Helen and I published a ton of articles together. Brilliant friend.
Well, so let's go back to that little line about mama's baby and daddy's maybe. You probably saw that story a couple of weeks ago of the woman that gave birth to twins and then I can't remember why she had a genetic test, but it turns out there was two different fathers. And I forget what her exact wording was, but it was something like, I was friendly with two different guys on the same day. Oh, were you?
And just so folks know, that's quite unusual. It's a sort of shock of reproductive biology, but it is possible.
But is there anything to that? Remember that book, Robin Baker and Mark Bellis's Human Sperm Competition? I've never checked to see if that's held up. There's 3 different kinds of sperm, or something like that.
I don't know. I haven't followed that literature too carefully. But we do know a lot more about sperm competition in different species, like in certain rodents, for instance. Sperm in a species that has a multi-male, multi-female mating system, we often think of an ejaculate with individual sperms if they're competing with each other. We have this vision of them all sort of swimming towards an egg. Well, it turns out if there's an ejaculate of another male, because your females engaging in multiple breedings, suddenly the sperm of the same male start to cooperate. So initially they're competing as individuals, but then they're cooperating as groups. So we're learning more and more. I mean, there's this kind of interesting science of the reproductive science. But one of the things from Baker and Bellis's classic book on sperm competition, they also had a number that gets used a lot that in their book, they said 9% of men were raising children that they hadn't actually sired. And it's sometimes popularly 1 in 10, but they had initially said 9. There was a study by anthropologist Kerman Anderson that looked at that a little further, this paternity certainty. And I talk about this in my book, in The Intimate Animal, because I think it's such an interesting finding and an example of once you look a little closer, there's something else going on. Kermit controlled for paternity certainty in different societies. And it turns out that if dads say, well, I'm not really sure, I don't know if I'm the dad, or we were casual at the time, or there were other people, or there's a cultural context where they say, well, it could be the whole village is the father, and what's sometimes called partible paternity, that then the number is quite high, right? There maybe there's a lot of the time that they're not genetically the father of the children. But when dads say that they're pretty sure, when they say, well, I think I'm the father, it turns out the number is not 9%. It's less than 1.5%. I think it was 1.3 or around there. So there is, what that tells us is that infidelity did have some evolutionary pressure on our species. This what we technically call extra pair copulation. But it's not as rampant as I think sometimes folks thought, or what some folks took away from Baker and Bellis, that there was pressure, but in the context of pair bonds, where you think you are the parent of offspring, the vast majority of the time people are.
Wasn't there a study showing that grandparents standing there next to the father in the maternity ward are more likely to say the baby looks like him than the mother?
Yes, and it's particularly maternal grandparents. So the mom's parents are the most likely to say, oh, the baby's got dad's nose. The baby's, because you're reinforcing this paternal involvement. Well, as you know, Michael, my wife and I just had a baby, and it's funny because I think about that study all the time when someone says, well, and it turns out he actually has blue eyes like I do. My wife has brown eyes, so I was like, he's got blue eyes. I'm like, that's right. He does have my eyes.
Yeah, here's how Marty Hazelton, you probably know Marty.
Yeah, I know Marty. I love Marty.
Explained this to me. I was researching this for my book, The Moral Arc, on abortion and why women are getting pregnant and so on. Yeah. Anyway, she said the range of non-paternity in the West is 2 to 4%, and perhaps a bit higher elsewhere in the world. In addition to the strength of norms about marriage, there are norms about fidelity that vary across populations. In the Himba, women marry, but there seems to be an accepted norm that people will sleep around. So women may not suffer the extreme costs that other women suffer in their infidelities are discovered. That might allow them to be freer to pursue a dual mating strategy. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then she said something about, and also ancestral women didn't travel on business trips or have husbands who did so. So I guess opportunity is part of it. But what does this mean, dual mating strategy? Explain that. And why isn't perfect 100% fidelity, as you said, it has an evolutionary origin, then why not make it 100%?
Yeah, exactly. And Marty Hazelton's written about this in a series of wonderful articles. And this idea of a dual mating strategy for some individuals, and I think that's what's so interesting about human romantic and sexual lives. So my argument, and one that I talk a lot about in the book, is how we can think about social monogamy and its tensions. But then humans do this remarkable thing as they respond to different ecologies. They respond to social environments and cultures. And then that's where then we start to see variation. But I think the tensions pull us back to this issue of social monogamy. So there are plenty of examples historically and cross-culturally where you can have a pair bond, but you also have sexual relationships outside those. Now, classically, we might think of infidelity and extra pair, this extra pair copulations. But there are cultures and contexts where it's understood that you're engaging in those behaviors. And what I find so interesting is in those places where it's understood that you maybe have sex with someone else, there's all this evidence of things like, of let's say cultures where men engage in infidelity and it's well known. I'm thinking of some examples from Anthropology in Asia by anthropologist Bill Jankowiak. Wives will report, well, I had sex with my husband before he went out because I knew what he was going to try and do tonight. So they'll say like, or I got him to stay home for another hour, or, maybe I tired him out and he stayed home. So even in cases where it's allowed in some sense, there's often a lot happening in the home to try to prevent it. And then there's also sometimes social rules. So in parts of India where infidelity are well known, male infidelity is tolerated. There is an exception, and that's that you don't talk about it. So even though everyone knows that men might step outside their marriage, you don't talk about stepping outside your marriage because it's too lowbrow. It's not culturally appropriate to discuss it, and certainly not to celebrate it. So there's often a lot of these kind of borders on when we think about these multiple mating strategies, or this idea that of engaging in casual sex outside the primary bond. And a lot of them are about somehow trying to still maintain the pair bond relationship. Even if you're engaging in sexual variety, how do you still preserve this primary relationship? And we see that in cases, certainly in societies. I'm thinking of the Aka and the Ngunda in Central Africa as examples of men will polygynously marry, they'll have multiple wives, and they'll talk about the importance often of their first marriage, of how intense it is, and how that partner understands them, even if they're having sex with new partners for the purposes of reproduction. Because in that social context, sex is for the purposes, it's work to reproduce. It's more pleasurable than daytime work, but it's still, there's a goal to that work. And then that's where you can start to see this separation of the social monogamy, the pair bond, and then the sexual activity.
Yes, and there's some big data sets. I think David Buss was talking about that, and you reference it in your book as well, from like Match.com and others, where like how many partners would you like to have had in a lifetime, or next decade or something? And men was like 7x higher than women or something like that. I mean, huge male female differences on these things. Like how many dates would you need to go out on before you'd have before you'd be intimate with somebody? And for the women, I think it was the average was 7, and for the men it was like 1.2 or something. So for some guy that said 2 dates, there's some guy said, why go out on a date? So I mean
exactly. No, keep going. I don't want to.
Well, so I mean, but why that difference? Okay, so for women, I guess the answer is it's riskier. So they have to be choosier. They're more risk averse, more careful. They only have so many eggs that are large. Men have infinite number of sperm, virtually, but that doesn't mean that, again, back to where we started, that men just want all the sex they can get, all the partners they can, and never have intimacy. Not at all. So, how do you sort of square that? Why would women cheat if it's so risky? Well, why? They're trading up for better resources, or they're neglected at home, or, actually, that's my favorite. One of my favorite pages from your book is, why people cheat. I've never seen these 8 reasons why people cheat. Anger. I was pissed off at him. Sexual desire. My primary partner lost interest in having sex with me. Lack of love, obviously. Low commitment. Esteem. It makes me feel good. Situation, I was drunk. Neglect, my partner neglected me. I guess that's similar to, no, it's lack of love. Oh, just out and out neglect. And variety. Okay, aren't men more likely to say variety than women? But there's other reasons. So there must be interesting nuances there.
Yeah, it's one of the most consistent sex and gender differences. Men are more interested in sexual variety and more interested in casual sex. And the big meta-analyses on sex differences, and some of them have argued that a lot of the effect sizes statistically are actually somewhat small. The exceptions tend to be men's greater interest in casual sex and interested in sexual variety. And exactly as you said, the cost for women are greater. And we could think of that in a lot of ways. There's reputational costs. There's higher risk of sexually transmitted infections, higher risk of pregnancy, higher risk of domestic violence. So if we have a tunnel vision of just thinking of evolutionary biology terms, maybe we're thinking the higher costs of reproduction. But then when we take it to human societies around the world, there's all these other costs that are also there: reputation, violence, how it could impact further partnering, and having other partners. So where there's more leeway for men, but exactly as you said, I think what happens too often is that people, including a lot of scientists, have taken that to mean, well, then men just are interested in, maximizing their number of sexual partners. And that's not really, when you look at the work of David Buss and David Schmidt, who's really good scientists, in fact, that's not what they're saying. And when you kind of look more cautiously at what they report in their studies, including these big studies with multinational findings, that love is still a big reason for sex and relational context. And because we have this pair bonding, because males are so involved in their partnerships in raising offspring, there's really not this pattern, with exceptions of people with a ton of resources. We know the stories of, the sultans who had 100 kids. And what we find actually is even in societies that allow partners to have multiple, most typically in the anthropological literature, it's men having multiple wives, where there are cases of women having multiple husbands. In those cases, there's often very strict rules that you need to be able to provide for all those multiple wives. And actually, back to Helen Fisher, she famously reported that even in societies that allow polygynous marriage, about 85% will still often marry monogamously, unless there's some skew of sex ratios.
So let's talk about mate guarding, jealousy. You open up your chapter called Stray about Sheriff Walter Harrison knocks off work early and goes home, and there's his wife in bed with another guy. And he pulls his gun out and shoots her. I forget what I was kind of rapidly reading this morning. Did she die? Was he convicted for murder?
No, she lived, actually. And it was the parts of the story that I got, it was someone in town, and I tried to track them down to interview them, and I couldn't. I wasn't able to. But the argument that I had been told was that his lawyers argued that because he was a sheriff, that he knew how to shoot to kill, and the fact that she lived meant that he didn't. It wasn't attempted murder. Interesting kind of legal argument to make. And they both lived. He changed careers, and it's interesting. We talk about crimes of passion, but this idea that the anger was. Where did it go? Where did he direct it? Not to this guy that he felt had wronged him, but that his wife had wronged him in this intense way, and we know that happens. We know that people. That's what's interesting about the notion of crimes of passion, and I think it goes back to this idea of people do intense things for sex. They do much more intense things when it comes to love. When it comes to, and I'm not a moralist about this. There's plenty of people who engage in casual sex. I've studied casual sex, and the questions that I'm interested, it's not pretending that that's not happening or that's not important to both men and women and college students and people in their 80s and of all different demographics engage in casual sex, friends with benefits, situationships. We see that in the data and we see that in our real lives. But for me, it's that when we understand couching sex in terms of intimacy, we start to understand its nuances, its motivations, its ups and downs. And I think we can understand more about our species that even in these cases of mate guarding, like I said, or jealousy, we might mate guard and be jealous about a potential partner. Let's say you're on the dance floor and you're trying to meet someone, or you're trying to attract a mate. But what we find is that it's much more intense once you already have the relationship with the mate. That's where we can see these intense reactions, like the sheriff I talk about in the book.
Isn't there? What's the statistic? If a woman is murdered, it's most likely to be an intimate partner, not just a random stranger. Yeah, most it's the highest. When you look at homicide among females, it's most often a domestic partner. Since you talk about polyamory and so forth. I guess I had Jeffrey Miller on the show too, and I asked him this. How do you deal with the jealousy? I mean, your partner's going out later tonight. It's all consensual. Everything's fine. Everybody knows what's going on. Yeah. That you don't feel jealous or like I really feel bad. My partner's having sex with some other person. Yeah. What does the data say about this? I mean, is this real? I mean, could people really do this?
Well, I'm curious what Jeffrey said. I have to listen to the episode.
Well, if I recall, he said when it's negotiated in an open, loving way, you can kind of get a hold of those natural jealous.
Exactly.
Emotions.
And there's different terminology. So polyamory means a plural love by definition. That's multiple romantic partners. The term that academics tend to use is consensual non-monogamy, CNM. We found in a series of studies about 1 in 5 Americans have at some point had some form of open relationship. Some folks have been critical of the term consensual non-monogamy in the academic literature. My friend Wednesday Martin, the anthropologist, I think has a very good critique of it, have said, like, well, who is it really consensual for? We're applying this notion that both partners are always okay and almost celebrating it. So some call it negotiated non-monogamy. And anyway, there's a lot of different terms. The term in the 70s was ethical non-monogamy, and that term isn't used that often anymore. And well, there is jealousy. We do know that folks that engage in open relationships or non-monogamy, negotiated non-monogamy, there is jealousy, and there's often a lot of things that they'll do to try to work through that. So let's say I'm going to make sure I see you twice a week. I'm going to make sure I see my new girlfriend twice a week. I'm going to make sure if I get you a watch, I'm going to get them a watch. How do you split your time, your resources? And there's a lot of talking. There's a lot, people often think, oh, these non-monogamous relationships, there must be a lot of sex. Well, there's also a lot of talking because you have to negotiate feelings of jealousy. And also feelings of what's called compersion, this idea that new partners bring with them this wave of excitement. And how do you not kind of forget about your other partner if you're interested in maintaining that relationship, that primary partnership?
That was one of the responses I had to Jeffrey, was when he described all the emails and communications and phone calls. It's like, who has time for all this?
Yeah.
It's massively time consuming.
I have a pet theory, and we've never quite gotten the data on this. There was one brain scan study looking at people in negotiated non-monogamy, and I have a feeling that for some folks, it's that they need more. They need more stimulus. They need more, just as we talk about variation in all sorts of other ways, when we start to think of relationship variation and what our needs are, that I'm not convinced that this is something that polyamory or consensual non-monogamy can work for everyone, because I don't think it can. In fact, the data would suggest most people aren't really interested in it. There was just a meta-analysis out pretty recently that said that when you look at the satisfaction rates of people in monogamous relationships and negotiated consensual non-monogamy relationships, they're the same. There's really no differences. And I think that that's so important because it blows up sort of two arguments about, if you have a moral argument about monogamous relationships, that they're so much better than any other structure, well, it turns out that satisfaction rates are the same. But the other argument that we'll sometimes see is sometimes folks who are non-monogamous will take a view that, well, monogamy is this shackle that it's imposed by society and you just have to get rid of it. And then we can just have free love and we'll be more happy. Well, actually, you're not any more happy. So the satisfaction rates are the same in these groups. I think that tells me it's not that one is better or worse than the other. There are different paths that people choose. Now, when I look at non-monogamous relationships, what I see most often, polyamory is an exception because they're really trying to negotiate multiple love bonds. But often what you see in a lot of non-monogamy, there's still a primary pair bond, even though there's open sexual activity around others. So for me, sometimes folks will say, well, don't these open relationships blow up a lot of your argument or what you're thinking? Like, no, actually, it's a perfect example of how some people can structure it and diversify in some ways. And polyamory is unique. It wouldn't work for a lot of people. And for those that it does work, it works wonderfully.
So jealousy, both men and women get jealous about equally, but men and women differ on what they get jealous about, right? So men about the sex, and is she going to get pregnant or whatever, and women about resources. Is he in love with her? Are you in love with her? Is a common question apparently. And then in other words, are you going to leave me for this other woman? Because that would be catastrophic. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's these classic studies that men are more upset by sexual infidelity, or this idea that if there's someone else, did you have sex with them? Women are more upset with, is there someone else, you're going to leave me for her? This emotional infidelity. But then in a handful of studies, when you give participants a third option, are you most upset by sexual infidelity, emotional infidelity, or both? A majority of both men and women say they're upset by both. And part of what we found in some of our work on infidelity is that in an experimental design, you can very clearly ask people which one upset you more. In real life, they blend together. So in real life, in real relationships, when you say, I had an emotional affair with my coworker, what I hear is, you're sleeping with your coworker. And so that there's this blending of the concern, and it's like, well, I'm upset that you were telling all your secrets, and I'm upset that you have this intimate connection, and I'm upset, like, did you sleep with him? You probably did. Maybe you did. It feels like you did. And right, so there's this that third option, and there's still that gender difference in the studies, but I think that tells us that for so many people, love and sex are yoked together, and how we conceptualize it, how we think of its meaning, how we think of what's the role of it in our lives, the importance of it in our lives.
I remember when the whole Bill and Hillary thing happened with Monica Lewinsky, and Hillary had some explanation that he had a difficult relationship with his mother. He wasn't breastfed. She had some cycle. And I remember just thinking, he's just a pig. He just likes a lot of different women. That's it. He's just variety. There's no deep, you don't have to go to therapy and find out what the cause is with your mother. Right? Yeah. I mean, is that, I mean, I'm sort of making a joke about it, but I mean, is that actually an explanation? Some men, why did they stray? Just for no reason at all. I just wanted variety.
Yeah, exactly.
I love my wife, but you know.
Yeah, and that for some people it really is this question of variety, of sexual variety. And what's interesting about that case also is that he was in a position of power. Well, there's a couple of things I could say interesting about that case. One is he was in a position of power. There was one study that people were brought into the lab to experimentally manipulate their sense of power. So you would be on a computer, you were winning a game or losing a game. There was a confederate, there was an actor in the room, a woman who would ask you what time it was. When guys were losing after the game, they would ask, was there someone else in the room? And they'd say, maybe, I think she asked me the time. When they were winning and you asked them afterwards, they'd say, oh yeah, there was this attractive woman in the room, or she was trying to talk with me, or she was trying to have a conversation. So this sense of power really does give us rose-tinted glasses. We see the world differently. So sometimes you think, oh, these high-status people are egomaniacs. They think everyone wants to have sex with them or to date them or be around them. Well, it's a cognitive phenomenon. They really do see the world differently. And sometimes people do. People are, they do try to bask in reflected glory of high-status individuals. So there's a lot that goes on in how you interpret the world. Now, imagine that. There's these risks of infidelity. I think to your point, to Marty's comment also earlier, that, going on business trips, part of if managing infidelity is if you're in a monogamous relationship, a socially monogamous relationship, and you don't want to challenge it, we cannot put ourselves in situations that promote, right? That you're on a business trip and you're out dancing to 2 a.m. with people, and it's not a great context if you want to preserve your relationship. But
do you have to be Mike Pence and have a rule to never be alone with a woman ever?
I'm in Indiana. This is Pence country. And no, I think that's a problem in other ways, right? For relationships, but we can. There's a difference between taking meetings and then, but then also saying, like, where do you think about? Because when we look at the 8 reasons you read for why people engage in infidelity. Historically, folks would often talk about what's called the deficit model in psychology. People engage in infidelity because there's a problem in their primary relationship. What we found when we did that study was it turns out a lot of infidelity is not because of a relationship problem. It's just because of opportunity. It's because of where you are, or it just happened, or people said I drank too much, or we were out too late, or I was working so much with this partner and no one else was around. So that means we can manage that. We can kind of biohack if we know that we're interested in sexual variety, well, if you want to preserve your primary relationship, do that variety in the context of your partner. Take vacations, try new behaviors, try new positions, have sex in a different room, right? You could find there's lots of ways you can integrate sexual variety. Now, again, it's not a moralist, or you could also open your relationship, but we know that most people aren't interested in that option. I want to say, if I can, one other thing about when you mentioned the Clinton case. Here at the Kinsey Institute, my colleagues did a study at the time of what does it mean to have sex, because part of that scandal was also, does oral sex count as sex? And my colleague Stephanie Sanders, who's our research director now, did this famous study that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The editor had to resign, actually, over the publication of this article because he was accused of engaging in political bias at the time. But he said it's just a new study that happens to be relevant to what's in the news. What they asked people, would you describe different behaviors as having had sex? And it turns out Clinton wasn't the only one. There were people who said, no, sex is just penetrative vaginal intercourse. And then there's some people who say you have to climax. Sex has to mean that there was an orgasm. Sex has to mean, and And for us, it's really important. Part of what we do here at Kinsey is we get really specific about methodology. When you ask someone about, did you engage in sex last night? What does that actually mean? And is it the same for a heterosexual couple? Is it the same for someone who's 19 and someone who's 80, for someone who's a lesbian and someone who's gay, right? The behaviors can mean such different things. And that's all about specificity of when we study sexuality.
Interesting. Yes. I think you have a discussion in your book about AI bots, sex bots coming, and would you consider it cheating if your partner had sex with a robot? You know, I hadn't really thought about that. I guess I might. I mean, it's like that's, I want to do that. I mean, come on.
Yeah, actually, that when we collected that finding, I remember thinking, I'm a scientist. Don't you want to understand, like, what are these different contexts? And what was interesting about that is so many people said they would, if their partner had sex with a robot, it's infidelity. Not as many feel that same way if they used a sex toy or a vibrator there are some people who do. Some people don't want their partners to masturbate or use sex toys.
Okay. Oh, right. You're right. That I would not consider that to be, violative. Not at all. Huh. Why? Yeah. Why is the robot? Maybe it's crossing that uncanny valley between a sex toy, a vibrator, and an actual sort of body-like thing.
Exactly, right? What did the robot look like? Was it 150 pounds? Did it have a face? Did it have it, right?
It looked like Brad Pitt. Oh, no.
Yeah. Now it's infidelity.
I want to ask you about something else here in the context of the Epstein files and Jeffrey Epstein and all that stuff. Constantly called a pedophile. And then a couple of weeks ago, Megyn Kelly got hammered for saying, well, it seems to me there's a difference between an 8-year-old girl and a 16-year-old girl. And she got pounced on like, oh, you're excusing pedophilia. No, I'm not. And then people commented online about there's pedophilia, attraction to prepubescent children, hebephilia, that is you're attracted to pubescent, age 11 to 14, roughly, and then hepaphilia? No, what is it? Hepabophilia. Yeah, mid to late adolescence, like age 15 to 19. So do we actually have research on this? I mean, are there these distinct differences that people find attractive?
Yeah, I've not done it. I don't work on this topic, but there are folks who are interested in, so this idea of pedophilia, attraction to prepubescent, hebephilia for attraction to minors who are postpubescent, with this idea that there's something very different psychologically of if someone has an attraction to a pre or postpubescent child. Now, I think the challenge there is that, and what we always have to remember is we are never prisoners of biology we have these big brains and we're able to make decisions. So I think that, okay, so is there a technical difference of a pedophile and a hebephile? And where do certain people that have been in the news fall? Okay, maybe. Although there's some evidence that Epstein was also interested in much younger women as well, or girls in that sense as well. So is there a difference in those psychological traits of what people are interested in? Well, yes, there have been studies by researchers that suggest that. But that doesn't change that we're not, even if someone has those attractions, they still have a brain. They're able to make decisions. There's ways that you can try to control your behavior. It doesn't justify it. And that's where you kind of quickly get this slope. And I think sometimes when folks try and make a scientific point where they're saying, okay, there's a distinction in terminology and the psychological characteristics of this attraction to minors, it misses the bigger point. And I think that's why Kelly got pounced on, as you said. It misses this bigger point of, yeah, but you still have a brain and you're able to make decisions and you know what you're doing is illegal, right? And we do live in social contexts that have laws and have regulations. And in the case of sex with minors, there's a reason for those laws. And there's questions about consent and cognitive ability. So if you're looking at just the body and making a comment about puberty, you're separating the body from the mind. And you're saying, well, if a body went through puberty, we know that the average age of puberty for girls in the United States is around 12. So you're making some comment about pubertal maturation and somehow divorcing that from psychological maturation. And as a biologist, I think that's a sort of a bizarre argument to make. A 12-year-old is still a 12-year-old. They're a kid in any way you cut it, even if something is happening to bodily maturation. And I think we have to be cautious about sometimes getting so focused on these definitions and missing the bigger picture. Bigger picture here is, the conversations about a predator, a predatory behavior towards children, and how that falls in a scientific taxonomy, that's not the conversation I think America is interested in having right now, or the world.
Yeah, and again,
doesn't mean they shouldn't, but it's not the conversation people are hearing.
Yes, and I think not in the category of knowledge is power. If you're a man seeking or desiring a variety of sexual partners, but you're married or you're committed to somebody, just knowing, well, so this is not abnormal. All guys feel like this, so I don't have to act on it. I know my buddy doesn't act on it, so I guess I can control it by knowing you're not a freak. Like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I want to have sex with a lot of
my
people.
marriage is over, or exactly. You could say that there's. I had a friend who used to say it's okay to look at the menu, just don't order an entree.
That's right. Yeah. But on the Harvey Weinstein case, there. Yeah, so there was non-consensual sexual contact and assault. Yes, okay, so that's criminal. But the director's couch or whatever they called it, there's some consent there, sort of. But again, if women don't have the economic power or choices that some of these men have, then that's in that blurry line between consent and economic need, like sex workers that are impoverished. Are you really doing this because you want to just get paid to have sex, and what's the problem? Versus I really have to do this because I have no choice. That doesn't feel as consensual.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that the challenge is that for people who are in power, they might, maybe last week there was someone who wanted to have sex with you because of what you could offer them in your career or financially or social context. That doesn't mean the next person who walks in your office is interested in it. And when you use your position of power to try and influence that they should do what that other person did, that's where we quickly start to see, that's where you get abuses of power. That's where you start to, the people are that's these cases where the lines of consent have been.
Like in the case of Virginia Giffey, the first victim that came forward about Epstein. She had said, she went to that island several times, and it's like, why do you keep going if they're sexually abusing you and raping you? And so I suspect at the time it wasn't that clear that it was, rape, and that in fact she thought she was going to get something out of it. He promised, I'll pay for their tuition in college and I'll get them jobs and I'll do this and that. So they probably thought it was more like a casting couch. That's it, casting couch sort of thing. And then later in hindsight, you think, oh, I see what was going on there. It was an abuse of power and I didn't have as much power. So that's why we have these laws now and changing norms.
Yeah. And it's an interesting question from when you think, okay, well, if you're engaging with sex with someone and there's a certain conditions that you're expecting, there's maybe behaviors that you will or won't engage in, or there's outcomes that, you're going to pay for my kid's college, and that doesn't happen. How do we understand that sexual interaction? If we think of it as an interaction, if we think of it as a negotiate, as part of a exchange of resources, maybe it's one's body for finances, but someone doesn't follow through on that. Is it just a bad negotiation, or was there some deeper violation because they didn't stick to what they said they were going to in the context of sex or love? There's also a similar, something we've seen in college student samples is partners, and particularly in heterosexual contexts, males attempting anal sex without ever talking to their partners. So they think it's part of the script and they just attempt it, never ask their female partners, is this something you want? Is this something we're going to do? And I remember in one study we were thinking of doing on consent, and young women saying, like, I don't know where this came from. We didn't, and sometimes forcibly men just trying anal sex. Also, there have been a series of studies on choking recently, and some of them have been in the news, been a couple of really interesting news articles and scientific studies on this non-consensual choking. People just view it as part of this sexual script. Really high numbers of young women are reporting that they've been choked during a sexual encounter, a seemingly consensual sexual encounter. Where is this script coming from? Possibly pornography. I don't think it's something our ancestors were doing. But it's not talked about. So this idea that you go home with someone, you're having sex with them, you think you know what you're signing up for, and then in the middle of it, you're getting choked because people think it's part of what one does during sex. This goes back to the sex education problem. I know I keep coming back to it, but it finds its ways into all these different problems. This lack of information, because we just grasp at straws to what we think is normal.
The arguments against pornography is it's teaching young men something about women that is not actually true.
Yeah.
They don't actually want all these things you've been watching online of these
No.
sex actresses pretending they like whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a case I was just thinking when you were talking of Napoleon Chagnon's research on the Yanomamo. And then one of his graduate students, I can't remember his first name, but it was Good, Goode. And he ended up marrying one of these Yanomamo teenagers. I think she was 14 or 15. They got married. They moved to New Jersey because I think he was at Rutgers University at the time. And then she was just bored out of her skull being a New Jersey housewife, after living in the Yanomamo. And I think she ended up going back. But in any case, it was an interesting cultural difference that, in Yanomamo land, 15 or so, that's it. You're an adult. You can get married. Whereas in I don't know how they did this in New Jersey, but whatever, however they got around the laws. So, there must be so speak to the cultural differences in some of these practices.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about when we look at the anthropological literature, and in between Kinsey's two books, the 1948 and 53 Kinsey reports, there was a book called Patterns of Sexual Behavior by Ford and Beach, an anthropologist and biologist. It's a great book. And there's so many insights in Ford and Beach. I might get the numbers wrong. If I remember correctly, I think they found, for example, and I get asked all the time, I was just asked by a journalist yesterday, is it biological that men sexualize the breasts? And there are a bunch of arguments that people use. But Ford and Beach found that I think it was in 188 societies that they looked, only 13 sexualized the breast. In most societies in the world, the breasts are for feeding babies, right? And it's part of anatomy. Doesn't mean that there's not sensation that's there and that they're not engaged in sexual activity, but this idea that they're explicitly erotic.
Oh, interesting.
Not true for most of the world. And the cultures have a lot of different variation about who you choose, how you choose, the role of family. There is not a species on this planet that family is as involved in courtship as they are in humans. And that's true in societies and cultures all over the world. And things about whether it's age or how you pair or the role of family or what courtship looks like. That's the amazing thing. That's the beautiful thing. But what we find over and over is there's also some universals. That within all that variation, that cultural diversity, as people are responding to ecologies and environments, there's also some consistent patterns. And that's some of what we've been talking about, some of what I write about in The Intimate Animals, that often couched in these long-term relationships.
Okay, let's go to your Match.com work. What do people want? What are they looking for? And maybe there's male-female differences then. And go ahead and make a recommendation. Like on my page, how much should I have about me versus what I'm looking for? And what are the things I should say? And can I really say I'm 6'1" when I'm 5'8"? No.
Yeah. Michael's got me giving relationship advice, everyone. So we've done this study called Singles in America with Match now for 15 years. We survey a sample of over 5,000 U.S. singles. They're not users on the app. It's a wider national, demographically representative sample. We use a third-party data collection firm. But we occasionally have also done studies where we've looked at Match users and what's going on in the apps. What's interesting is that over and over again, everyone's really focused on your pictures and how attractive you are. And in fact, if you're swiping, you're also largely looking at someone's pictures. But in all the studies on partner preferences, we've been talking about some of the folks earlier, like David Buss's studies, David Schmidt's studies, some of our studies, and all these different studies on partner preferences. The thing that shines over and over again is people looking for someone who is kind, looking for someone who they can trust. In our study, we found the top traits that you're looking for in partner preferences: someone you can trust and confide in, someone who you can be humorous with, someone who's comfortable in their sexuality, someone who's kind. So the traits that matter most, yes, we all want someone we're attracted to, but the traits that matter most are all things that are important for long-term relationships. That's where all those things, kindness, trust and confide in, you want that in a long-term partnership, right? It's less important on a one-night stand. I mean, you want to make sure the person doesn't kill you. That's the other. You don't want to go home with someone who, a little bit of risk can be fun. A little bit of risk is exciting, not so much risk that you feel for your life. And so we talk about those studies too. But so what we find is this desire for trust and kindness. What that means is that you want to be pretty honest in your dating apps and profiles. Because if I'm saying I value someone I can trust, and I look at your profile and I realize you lied to me on the first date, I realize that you lied, you're about 6 inches in height, or you're 40 pounds heavier than you were in the app, or you're thinner than you were in the app, or whatever it is, that if it just appears that you were lying, you suddenly destroy the thing that's most important in early courtship. So you want to put your best foot forward, sure, but you don't want to put things that are so radically different from the truth. And in fact, we find most people don't. Most people, there is catfishing that happens on the apps, but most people are not, because many people realize this. And okay, but now on the part of advice, what should you do on the apps and the websites? I think one of the most important things people can remember is that if you're in this courtship mode, digital courtship, using the apps, you have to remember that it's a two-way street. The courtship is dyadic. So if you go on the app, some people just go and they go, well, I'm searching. And I'll often think, well, what's in your profile for someone who's searching for you? And we forget, we get in search mode and I say, well, this is what I'm looking for. Well, what's everyone else in your community looking for? Right? What's everyone in your neighborhood looking for? Do you have pictures of yourself? Did you fill out your profile? Do you have things that someone could hook onto? So you want to have things on your profile that someone can hook onto. I want to be able to look at your pictures and not just see, okay, there's 10 pictures of Michael outside, but then, oh, you were hiking Machu Picchu. I've always wanted to go there. I almost went 3 years ago. You need to give people opportunities to connect with you. And I think that's the biggest mistake. Folks often get on and they just search and they forget it's that two-way street. So these apps are really about connecting, and you've got to both be open to connecting and give people opportunities to connect with you.
Interesting. And to what extent are those sites successful at making successful, happy matches that end up in marriage and so forth, versus old school dating clubs, church, friends, blind dates through friends, whatever?
Yeah. The data show that most singles in the United States, at least in the U.S. context, most singles met their most recent first date through an app or a website or through the internet in some way. So it's the most common way singles today are meeting. Studies looking at relationship satisfaction and stability suggest that whether you meet online or offline, the relationships are just about as stable and satisfied. Some studies actually suggest the online ones are higher satisfaction or higher in stability, with this idea that when you take the subsample of people who are on the apps and websites, they're the ones that are actively in the dating mode because they're really looking for a relationship. So there's a kind of a bias in that comparison. So the apps and websites are the most common way, but we also see there's actually a rise in matchmaking. Matchmaking has been around a long time. It's been around for thousands of years. But professional matchmakers are seeing more attention in recent years. But if you go to a professional matchmaker, you could spend anywhere from a few $1,000 to $100,000 to be a client. I'm thinking of one in particular that I know it's $100,000 to be your client.
Whoa.
And
now, is
so
that a weeding out process? Like
it's a weeding out process.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's the same on the apps. The apps that you pay for, you're kind of weeding out. You're getting people who are willing to pay a few dollars and be focused. And sometimes the free ones, there's a little bit more noise of what's going on. Now, 10 years ago, people would say you could be on a free app, but you would buy, let's say, super likes or super hearts. And I'd say, okay, I spent $1 on someone to show I'm really interested. For young people today, they call that cringe. They say that they're not, you're trying too hard. Why are you spending money to try so hard? So we're seeing patterns change of how different generations are using this technology and the expectations of what you do and you don't do. So the other part of that I think is interesting too, as we think about dating across generations, like what used to happen on a campus. Well, if you try doing it in these, on the apps, well, the different generations have very different expectations. So you might have status, but you're totally out of sync with the culture because you're in your own generational culture.
Yes, I met my wife sort of online. She emailed my office to complain about the shipping costs to Germany of our magazine and our books, our swag and stuff here with Skeptics, and then my office sends these to me, and I respond, and people are surprised to hear it from me, and then that. It's good for business anyway. But she wrote back and sent a picture, and I was a single guy, and she's a good-looking, blonde-haired, blue-eyed German woman. I'm like, oh, I will hand deliver our magazine. That's the kind of service we provide. So funny. Anyway, it did work out. So and now we
well done for both of you. Yeah,
it's too funny. But
well, you took a risk. I think that what I love about that story is also, and this is true for anyone who's thinking about courtship, is you take a risk. You've got to put a sort of I think what we are seeing increasingly, there's all these sort of hot takes about what's happening to dating culture today. Part of it is that we're seeing more and more people are too cautious about taking risks of like, let someone know you like them. In fact, it's great to let someone you like them, because knowing that someone's attracted to you makes you more attractive to them. So if you like someone, make sure that they know that you like them, because there might be more, it'll increase their interest in you. So
yeah, that's good advice too. How many scams are there out there, and what should you look for that you're not being scammed here? I'm thinking of the Tinder Swindler documentary on Netflix. You probably saw that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ones, and there's catfishing. And we did a study on safety, like digital cyber safety and dating, and people are concerned about them. These sort of catfish or different scams. I mean, I think you want to be cautious for the most part. If you're on an app or a website, someone's asking you for money or your home address, you should always be cautious about that. In general, it's a scam if that happens. But we do recommend, based on the evidence, if you're, on apps and websites on your first date, meet somewhere in public, bring your own transportation. That, particularly for first dates, try to do it in a way that is comfortable. People know where you are. There's so many options now. You can put location tracking on your phone. You should tell friends you're going on a date, or there's ways that you can be cautious about where you meet someone and how you meet them. Now, for hookup apps, what's so interesting is a lot of them, they're just saying, well, here's my home. Come and knock on the door. I'll leave it unlocked. So people who are just looking for casual sex on the apps that cater to that, there's a whole other kind of safety question that comes up, often because you're sharing your home address and things with people that you don't really know.
Yeah. I've been getting all these, you probably get these too, these random texts, hey, are we still meeting next week? Sort of thing. Yeah. So I've been having some fun with them to see how much of their time I can waste, but I've never gotten far enough to see what the ask is, so I don't actually know. Usually they're pretending, if they find out I'm a guy, it's I'm a woman, and they send me a picture and a name, or if it's earlier than that, I'll say something like, Julie, I told you, it's over between us, go back to your husband. Wrong number. Another one I did, something like, can you talk later today or something? And I said, I thought we agreed that we weren't going to talk until the police were off our case. Okay. Yeah. Remember? And did you remember to ditch the gun and bury the head?
Yeah.
What? But
I just got an email funny right before we logged on. It was once in a week I'll look at my spam folder, and it was one that said I've inherited 25 million based on my last name, and I have to log on. I thought, my last name's Garcia. There's millions of us. How did you know?
That's too funny. Yeah, I know several of them that went out for maybe 20 texts or so. That they often mention they're into crypto. So I thought, maybe that's the ask. Can we do a crypto donation, or I don't know what? But I've never gotten that far to know what what they're actually going to ask for. In the case of the Tinder swindler, he asked for a wire transfer. He was like in Switzerland on a business trip on a Friday afternoon, and the business deal has to close tomorrow, and the bank doesn't open till Monday at 9 a.m. Can you send me $10,000 or whatever? And there's the moment. But he was pretty clever. I mean, he strung those women out for, like thousands of texts. They had him on the phone. Yeah. And, we're going to get married. We're going to have kids. You're the one. And they'd already gone out on dates on his private plane, which apparently he funded from the previous victims. Yeah. And so on.
And I think what bothers me about those is that where it's so obviously deception. And it's the same. I had years ago, someone asked me with, there was a website that catered to people who were having affairs. And if it's Ashley Madison.
Ashley Madison, yes, of course.
Yeah, you're having affairs. And the challenge is, for me, as a scientist who studies variation in relationship context and sexual context, if you want to have sex outside your relationship, again, that's a decision someone makes. But when you're deceiving partners, that's where I have an issue, right? Where as opposed to, well, can you negotiate it? Can you talk about having an open relationship? Can you, and in the context of these scammers with, dating, but there's plenty of people who engage in sex tourism and romance tourism, and you go on vacation for a week and you buy each other thing, or one person's buying the other things and trips and food, and you're expending a lot of resources. But you also kind of know it ends at the end of the week, that there's this romance tourism. Sometimes it turns into a marriage. Sometimes the person flies back home with you. But in this case of the swindler, right, there's this Tinder swindler where it's deception. That I have a real problem with, because I think that it violates the norms of what we want. Even if we're playing, whether you're doing the girlfriend experience in Pahrump, or whether you're, in the Caribbean and doing romance tourism, you at least kind of know where the borders and boundaries of what you're doing are. as opposed to lying.
Oh, I had another joke. This from a gay guest I had, who said, you know what you call? Let's see, what do two lesbians do on a second date? They rent a U-Haul and they move in together. What do two gay guys do on a second date? What's a second date?
Yeah.
Okay, that reminds me of another story David Buss had. The finding about, like, how many dates would you need to go on before you'd be intimate? 7. Okay, whatever. I think it was 7. And then he got contacted by one of these seduction sites, and like, we want to use your research and explain to guys how they could take a woman out on one date in like 7 different places so she feels like she's been on 7 dates. And David's like, I'm not helping you with this.
Yeah.
This is crazy. So what do you?
Yeah,
I mean, there really are
fun.
seduction sites, and there are people that do this sort of thing to exploit the psychology.
Yeah, this idea that you kind of and that it can be gamified, right? And that trying to exploit people's interests. I mean, what I find so fascinating in that is, I mean, the best detector is the human brain. We've evolved over 4 million years of engaging in this sort of social monogamy of mating with partners. Honesty is really the best policy in this sense, not looking for the best, scam to convince someone to have sex sooner, to fall in love sooner. Engage with each other, get to know each other, be vulnerable with each other, trust and confidence. Let someone know what you like about them. Those are all things that the literature shows over and over again, builds that sense of closeness and that attraction. We just have to listen to our bodies and our brains to get there.
All right, so you mentioned recovery after a breakup. So talk about divorce, breaking up, male-female differences, and how long it takes to get recovered from that and find love again. It does happen, and so on. What do we know about that whole subject?
I love talking about this because I think we don't spend enough time thinking about relationship dissolution and breakups. And it's so intense for so many people when it happens. It's a whole physiological, psychological process. Some people report feeling pain, physical pain. And when you look at the brain scans of people who have gone through romantic breakups and dissolution, it turns out their brain pain centers are going off. It's not just, in their imagination. They are going through pain. Actually, the brain looks remarkably like someone going through cocaine withdrawal when you're going through a relationship breakup. And there's all this sort of hokey advice of people. You say, oh, you went through a breakup. Oh, just get back on the horse, get back dating. But we don't often think of it as grief. But for a lot, when you're going through a breakup, especially if you love the partner or if you're in love with them, there's really a grief process. And I often think, we should think about mourning relationships a little bit more. That's what the science would tell us. What's my take is, give people the space to mourn and to think and to grieve. As we go through those. And I think breakups have a much bigger impact on our health and our well-being than we often think about. And we're seeing young people today go through more breakups than their parents' generations because they have more relationships often before they settle into a long-term bond. So I think doing more to understand that. One of the things I'm really interested in, we did a study with my colleague Amanda Gesselman here, was also how there's such differences. So some people, it's not a stable trait. It's not like every time I go through a breakup, I go on a bender for 3 days, right? It's we'll talk to people and say, well, I went through this breakup and I abused alcohol and drugs for a few months. I went on this next breakup, I was depressed for a week. I went on this breakup, I gained 10 pounds. I went on that breakup, I lost 10 pounds. So the fact that it's not a stable reaction for each time, that tells us again that relationships are dynamic and how we're processing them psychologically about what we were getting or not getting in each individual romantic and sexual relationship. So I think there's so much more we should be studying about breakups, but also how they impact our well-being and how we kind of culturally deal with them. I think in the book I use this example of in the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva when someone dies, that you kind of friends and family come over and you honor the person that you lost and you honor the grief that people are going through. You talk about, you process it. We often don't do that in breakups. You just tell people, all right, come on, it's time to move on. You wouldn't tell a drug addict, oh, come on, it's time to move on. But in fact, in the brain, they're going through withdrawal in very similar ways. So I call for a lot more empathy and understanding when people are going through a relationship dissolution and breakups. I think we pay a heavy toll. And Mother Nature took our pound of flesh, right? The fact that we evolved these intense bonds when they break, that's why they hurt so much, because they evolved to be intense and to be stable. Not necessarily lifelong, but to be stable for long periods of time.
Okay, sort of last big question here on, we've been tracking the debate here about the effects of the internet and smartphone on kids. Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twang's research on this. One of the findings apparently is which they're having less sex, they're not having as many dates, they're not drinking as much. Maybe that's good. Getting driver's licenses much later. Jean Twang's data point on that was between my generation, baby boomers, the average age of first pregnancy for a woman was 19. Now it's 29. Mm-hmm. It's a whole decade slower. Yeah. Okay. So how does this affect the future of love and intimacy and sex and all that?
Earlier in my career, when I was trying to understand hookups as someone interested in the evolution of love, I reported on these secular trends of how age at first birth and first marriage were going up and up, and age of puberty was going down and down. So we were creating these historically unprecedented gaps between biological maturation, reproductive maturation, and actual experiences. Well, what do we think is going to happen in those big gaps? You're talking about 15, 20 years. People were experimenting with their sexual and romantic lives. They were testing boundaries of what they wanted, what they didn't, whether that was hookups or casual relationships, different multiple long-term relationships. So those, we know that those are happening. So we are experiencing things that, even though we have these evolved mechanisms in our biology and our behavior, we're experiencing, our bodies are experiencing contexts that our ancestors didn't. And we're in environments, including these technological environments that our ancestors were not in. So in some ways, we're in this evolutionary brave new world of trying to think of how does the evolved animal, the intimate animal within, navigate these spaces. Sometimes it's predictable. So when, for instance, when we look at dating apps, you maybe can't hear the person's voice or smell them or know their social network, but we do know that people are honing in on things like they look at teeth in pictures because it's a sign of hygiene. And if we were next to each other, I would smell you and look at you to see hygiene. So we do other things to try and still satisfy that, that primate within, looking for, a partner that's as positive, as clean hygiene, doesn't have a high disease burden. But in other ways, I think the challenges with the technology are overload and distraction. So for the things I'm interested in, one of the challenges with technology is this sense of an unlimited resource. You pick up your phone and you think you can find 1,000 mates. It makes it really hard to focus on one. And it makes it really hard on a first date to start thinking about the second date because you're thinking about 30 other first dates you can have because there's so many options. In fact, in one experimental study where people, I think they saw either 6 options or 24 options, people who saw a smaller number of, it was like a fake online dating setup and design, experimental design, people were more satisfied when they had only 6 compared to 24. Because when you had 24, you're constantly thinking the grass is greener. There's other maybe I should have picked that person. But one of the things that we learned from relationship science is a great reminder is that we think the grass is greener on the other side. The grass is greener where you water it. So we really have to think about how do we focus our attention on the person in front of us. And I think that's our challenge with technology. Our brains did not evolve with so many options, so much information. I mean, I think even with my graduate students now, right, how what they can sit down in a half a day and find on their computer as opposed to sifting through a library for weeks and weeks. We're getting rapid amounts of information. Then you have to know how to curate it. And you have to know when to make a decision of which one you're going to use. That's impacting our mating lives in ways that we are just beginning to understand.
Oh, interesting. It's like that paradox of choice, having too many choices of anything. Like standing there paralyzed in front of the toothpaste section of the supermarket. I don't know which one to get. Too many. Yeah.
I know. My wife and I go to this restaurant, and I joke all the time because the menu is huge, and I always think, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try the salmon. I've gotten the same goddamn salad for the last decade, right? And it's too many choices.
Yeah, that's too funny. All right, our future. Let's see. Are we really going to have sex bots? I mean, if that's your only choice, I don't care. But if you're having sex bots instead of intimacy with a biologic, as they say, and then what's the future of human population? As you know, Elon's been on about this, but we've been aware of this. This birth dearth is coming, and I had a economist on the podcast who wrote a book called After the Spike. after the spike. The population spike is going to hit around 2050, 2060 at about 10 to 11 billion humans. And after that, it is going down, and there is nothing governments can do about it. Apparently, tax breaks for having multiple kids or any of that stuff doesn't work, because especially if women have economic power and choices, they just don't want to have that many babies. And so, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think, one, we know that there's a lot of individual differences. There's a lot of individual variation. So as we start to scan what people want and how they're thinking about, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. And it's when we think about reproduction and if you want babies, and there are people who are worried about the environment. There are people who are worried about finances. How the heck do you afford it? What are the social safety nets? What's the education? So it can be hard to make these sort of blanket statements of like, what does the population want? What does the species need and want? There's a lot of variation in the when you start to look at what people are interested in. We do know, though, for instance, when you're in long-term relationships, you're more interested in having kids. So when you ask, over a third of the adult population in the United States today is single. So you ask the population about their interest in kids, you're asking all these singles. Well, if you ask people who are in a new relationship if they want kids, they have a very different answer than when they're single, because they have a potential partner to raise them with. So there's all that nuance, right, in these questions about reproduction. I do think technology, I did an open to debate on this, on the use of AI in our, AI boyfriend and girlfriend. And I think for a lot of people, some of this technology can be good training wheels. It could be good practice. You can kind of start to explore. But once we start thinking of the technology, and this is a point that I think Jean has made too, Jean Twenge, in some of her work, is when it starts to become a distraction from our social relationships, a distraction from our romantic and sexual connections, or competing with them, that's where we run into a problem. And I say that, I think we run into a problem as a species. Like, that's where this is a species in crisis, that we haven't done a great job of using this social technology to amplify, to be a tool to make our real connections better. Too often they're competing with our real connections. You're sitting at a table texting as opposed to using the phone to say, hey, honey, look at this video I want to show you so we can bond over it. Instead, you kind of focused on the device and not the people. And I think that has profound implications for us as a social animal, that we're studies are just still trying to understand how profound that is in terms of fertility rates, mental health, sexual satisfaction, psychological health, physical health. So at the end of the day, we are a social primate, and we need those social connections, and we're a pair bonding species, like those gibbons behind me. And so I think that the great challenge for us is, how do we use technology to how do we harness it to make those relationships better? And I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of my thought on like pornography. Is it a problem? I don't know. Is it? Are you doing that instead of having intimacy with your partner? I mean, do you have a gambling problem? I don't know. Did your spouse leave you, take the kids, and you lost your job? Yeah. In that case, you have a problem, right? So,
that one a problem. Yeah.
What are the effects on your life? Okay. Anyway, that's it. The Intimate Animal. There it is. The science of sex, fidelity, and why we live and die for love. So interesting, Justin. You just get, everyone's got to read this book. It's astonishing that we really have to go back to the basics. What does the science say about who we are? And once you know, knowledge is power. You can make your decisions about what you want to do. All right. Thanks so much, Justin.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks, everyone.